Open up if you're able to, or turn on to your device and have a look at the third chapter of Ruth. Ruth chapter 3. We're in our part 3 of a series on the book of Ruth. And 2 weeks ago we looked at chapter 1, and the focus was in chapter 1 that family is what? Family is where you find it. And then in chapter 2 last week, we looked at God always providing, and we looked at a number of ways that God gives his provision to us. And today we're looking at the third chapter of Ruth. And the title of this morning's focus on this third chapter of Ruth in the Old Testament is Fortune Favours the Brave. Do you notice there, Amy, that I've spelled favours the correct way and not the American way? Did you notice that? Yeah, I had to spell check that. So, fortune favours the brave. Now, Dave, I thought I'd start out the talk today looking at Ruth chapter 3 and fortune favours the brave with a dad joke. A dad joke on the book of Ruth. And of course, David, there is only one dad joke that can ever be told about the story of Ruth. And that dad joke is, what was Boaz, Ruth's future husband, what was Boaz like before he met Ruth? Ruthless. Of course he was. Thank you, Amy. Well done. That's the only dad joke that can be told. You've heard that before, have you, Amy? Of course he was. Boaz was ruthless before he met Ruth. Anyway, thanks, Amy, for making sure that that joke went well. So we're going to have a read of the first couple of verses here in the book of Ruth, and we're going to break up this story of fortune favouring the brave into 3 sections of chapter 3. The first section, we're going to call it the plan, and that's 5 verses. We're going to look at the second section, Lincoln. We're going to look at the plan in action, which is going to be verses 6 through to 13, that middle section there, Dave. And then the last section of Ruth chapter 3, we're going to look at the results of the plan. So what is it? The plan in action, and then the results of the plan. And I'm going to need a little bit of help in doing this. Now, Paul, would you mind coming up onto the stage here? Paul is 12 years old. We might use this one here. Everyone say good morning to Paul. Morning, Paul. Paul is you're 12 years old, aren't you? And Paul and his family, come over here, Paul. Do you want to do this here? Paul and his family come to Wallsend Church here, and Paul is probably one of the smartest 12-year-olds I know. And Paul, and the reason I know that is because Paul and I have Bible studies once a week, don't we? And Paul, most of the questions you ask, I've got to say, we'll study that next week, don't I? Yeah. Because I don't actually know the answer. And so I'm going to need a week to kind of research it and come back to Paul. But by the time we then come back the following week, you've got lots of new questions, and I've got to say we'll do that next week. So, Paul, would you mind just giving me a hand here in reading Ruth chapter 3, the first couple of verses, and we're looking at the plan of fortune favouring the brave. So, Paul, can you do that? Everyone's got Ruth chapter 3 open? Of course, I've mentioned it often enough. Paul, let's have a look at this. Ruth chapter 3. I think it's working. Is this the microphone working, Kobe? I think it is working. You want to test it?
No, you test it.
Just say something into it and see if everyone can hear you.
No.
No, okay. All right.
I just have to hope.
Just do whatever you want there, Paul. Just do.
What's that noise?
Oh, I think it's the audience laughing at me. I think that's what that noise is. Yeah. Do you want to give that a go?
Yep.
First one.
One day Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi spoke to her.
She said, "My daughter, I must find a home for you. It should be a place where you will be provided for."
So here is the plan. Here is the plan. Verse 2.
"You have been working with the women who work for Boaz. He is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be separating the straw from his barley on the threshing floor."
So, Paul, it's harvest time. Boaz is a farmer. Ruth has been working in one of his fields with some of the other women. And the threshing floor is where they separate all of the good stuff of the barley and then throw all of the all of the useless stuff away. So maybe, Paul, could you read verses 3 and 4? Now, I need to warn you here, Paul, that in this plan, it gets a little bit girly. So there's going to be some boyfriend-girlfriend stuff happening. Is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, good.
"So wash yourself, put on some perfume, and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let Boaz know you are there. Wait until he has finished eating and drinking. Notice where he lies down. Then go over and uncover his feet. Lie down there. He'll tell you what to do."
Oh, okay, this is where it starts getting a bit girlfriend-boyfriend stuff there, Paul. So everyone give Paul a round of applause for doing that. Well done. Paul, is that the first time you've read something out in church? Well done. Well done. Boaz will tell you what to do. Now, in this plan, it's Naomi's plan, but it is Ruth's courage that's required for the plan to actually work. And the reason why I say it is Ruth's courage is because Ruth has to, a foreigner that is, someone who is a stranger to this land, somebody that people are already gossiping about, Ruth has to get up, dressed up like a bride, go down to the threshing floor at harvest time, filled with men and testosterone, and propose marriage to a man. Now, that takes courage on Ruth's part to enact that plan. And the reason why Ruth is prepared to do this for Naomi, her mother-in-law, is this. If you've been here the last couple of weeks, you will know that Ruth and Naomi's husbands have died. They don't have any children from those marriages. And Ruth has agreed to go back to Naomi's land there in Bethlehem to make sure that Naomi is looked after. Now, there is a problem. The problem is that Ruth, being a widower, Naomi, being a widower with no children, have no financial security in the culture that they're in. Back then, Harley, if you can believe this, that women couldn't own any property. That if their husbands died and they had no children, their husband's property was passed on to someone else. And here is the problem. And that is why Naomi is suggesting that she goes down to the threshing floor, dressed as a bride, to propose marriage to Boaz. There are three things that denote significance 3,000 years ago in the culture of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. Three things that denote significance and success. The first is land. To Ruth and Naomi, their husband's land was going to be passed on to someone else. The second thing that denotes significance is children. Ruth and Naomi have none. The third thing that denotes significance is your name. And with their husbands dying and being childless, their names would soon be forgotten. Land, children, name and reputation. When we see this, don't we, David, in Genesis chapter 12, God's promise to Abraham. What was God's promise to Abraham? Go to the land that I will give you. There I will make your descendants like the stars of heaven. And I will also bless you and make your name great. There is significance and success in Abraham's eyes. So there is the reason for the plan. Propose marriage to Boaz because something will happen. The reason why this plan was put forward by Naomi was this strange cultural thing 3,000 years ago where that if your husband died and you had no children, that you could marry someone else as a family redeemer. They had to be related to your husband. If you married someone else, a family redeemer, a kinsman redeemer, then the land that your dead husband owned could stay within the family, but there was a catch. The catch was that the person that agreed to marry you, the man that agreed to marry you, and spoiler alert here, David, Boaz is going to agree to this. He likes the smell of Ruth's perfume. The catch is that Boaz, the family redeemer, has to agree that the children that come out of that marriage aren't his, but are the children of his wife's former husband. The other catch is this, is that often not only did you need to relinquish the rights to those children, not only did the land stay with someone else, your dead husband's family, but the other sacrifice was that the payment you made was to pay off any debts incurred by your wife's former husband. You lost privilege and you lost money. To be a kinsman redeemer that Boaz, spoiler alert, is going to agree to do, you lost a lot. There's a connection here with Jesus 1,000 years later. Jesus, as our brother, agrees to be our kinsman redeemer, our family redeemer. It takes courage for Ruth to go down to the threshing floor at harvest time. Why would Ruth do this, Ian? Why would she risk such significant embarrassment? What if Boaz said, I want nothing to do with you when she had a good job. Things were beginning to turn for Ruth. Why would she agree to do this? It wasn't for her, it was for Naomi. And often when you feel a plan is for the benefit of someone else, it takes courage. And to step out in faith on a godly endeavour like that, we need to know that fortune favours the brave. Let's have a look here at verse 5, because what does Ruth say in verse 5? I will do everything just to Naomi, just as you have said. Let's have a look at the plan in action. In fact, let's just read through verse 7 here. Verse 7 and 8. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet. And Kelvin, let's not talk about the Bible often using feet as a metaphor for private parts. Let's not talk about that. It's just a little bit of scandal, but we know that this is not actual. because all through the book of Ruth, Ruth is described as a virtuous woman. But Ruth uncovers Boaz's feet and lays down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. Of course, his feet were cold. No, I just added that bit. Something startled the man. He turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. Now, Lincoln, we need to whisper this next bit here. Because you can imagine, he's startled, he wakes up, and there at his feet is a girl dressed up as a bride, smelling fantastic, sleeping there. But there's all these men around, and Boaz knows Ruth. He likes Ruth. He's seen Ruth working. He knows what Ruth is doing for Naomi. And so he whispers, "Who are you?" And what does Ruth say? "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer." Can you imagine waking up one night, Lincoln, and having, when you're older, a girl say, "Will you marry me?" Scandalous. But do you know there is elsewhere in the Bible, Ezekiel, for example, where God says to us that he loves us. And in Ezekiel it says he loves us so much that he spreads his garment over us. Ruth loved Boaz and was asking Boaz to love her. Sounds like that line from that movie with Julia Roberts and... What movie am I thinking of? Notting Hill. I'm a girl standing in front of a boy asking a boy to love her. That story's 3,000 years old in the book of Ruth. That's what Ruth is doing. She's lying at a man's feet asking that man to love her. I've got a gut feeling here, Paul, that Boaz already loved Ruth. I mean, she was resourceful. She was virtuous. She was industrious. She was a hard worker. She cared for other people. What's not to love about a person like Ruth? I had a feeling that Boaz already loved Ruth even before she came down to the threshing floor that night. But there's a plot twist. Lincoln, there's a plot twist. There's another man. There's another man in this story, and that man was a closer family member than Boaz. And that other man, according to Jewish culture, that other man had the right to marry Ruth before Boaz did. That would be a plot twist, wouldn't it? That other man had the right to marry Ruth before Boaz did. Now, Boaz could have just married Ruth, but he wanted to do the right thing. Boaz is a virtuous man as well, a man of integrity. Boaz was willing to risk losing Ruth to make sure that everything was done the right way. He wanted to go to the other man and say, "Ruth is yours," willing to risk losing a woman he was in love with. But guess what? Fortune favours the brave. Let's have a look at the results of this plan. This idea that fortune favours those. God smiles upon those who are willing to take a risk in his kingdom. You know, why did Seventh-day Adventist missionaries heading abroad 100 years ago, why did they pack their belongings in coffins? because that was how many of them were told that they would return. Why did they do that? Why did they take such significant risks to spread the gospel? Well, we talk about them today, and fortune favours the brave. Is there a particular step that you sense the Spirit calling you to take, but there are risks involved? And yet you know in your heart that if you take a step in faith, something significant might happen. Because, Teresa, fortune favours the brave. The results of the plan. The morning after, we could call this. Verses 14 through to 18 and chapter 4 as well. This is where our series concludes. There's one more chapter in Ruth, and maybe, Sonny, when you get back from your trip up to the Kimberley in the northwest of Australia, maybe we might hold off reading through chapter 4 until then, but maybe I might even just finish it now. Let's see how we go. Because the results of the plan occur from verse 13 onwards and also chapter 4. Ruth's name had the potential that morning to be tarnished, and yet Boaz says, don't tell anyone you're here. Step out quietly here. Here's some food to make sure that your mother-in-law is not going hungry. I'm going to go away and do the right thing. And in verse 18, when Ruth gets home and Naomi says, how did the whole thing go? Ruth tells her mother-in-law this. Naomi tells her daughter-in-law this. Just be patient, my daughter, until we hear what happens. Boaz won't rest until he has settled things today. And in chapter 4, we read that Boaz does make things right. He does settle things with the man. He does marry Ruth. And they have a child. And that child's name is Obed. And Obed has a son named Jesse. And Jesse has a son named King David. From a risk taken on a threshing floor one night, big things happened because fortune favours the brave. The message of Ruth chapter 3 is that your chance of success in doing anything with significance in the kingdom of God requires stepping out in faith, but knowing that fortune favours the brave. I'm going to finish the story there. Paul, is that okay? We might come back to it another time when Sonny and Lockie and the Reed kids get back. But Paul, I'm going to finish today's focus on Ruth chapter 3 with a poem. And this poem may speak to you about the difference between stepping out in faith or staying safely in your seat, metaphorically speaking. And it's a poem that is a little bit sad because it's a poem about opportunities missed, perhaps, in people's lives. And if this poem speaks to you about taking a risk, then may God bless your heart as you open yourselves to his leading. Here's the poem. There was a very cautious man who never laughed or played. He never risked, he never tried. He never sang or prayed. And when he one day passed away. His insurance was denied. For since he never really lived, they claimed he never died. Anything in the kingdom of God, anything of significance, has required a step of faith, despite the risks, because fortune favours the brave.